first question that I have for you is, how was it that you changed your position on your eschatology view? And why do you think that...
Is that supposed to be persecution or something?
Why do you think that...
Are you all going to persecute me for that? Is that what this is? The doors are all of a sudden locked, and a bunch of Tim LaHaye books come flying through the windows.
Because I've been on a similar change as you have. So,
okay.
How did you change that position? What was it that changed that position? And then why do you think that view of eschatology is so important?
Well, Jeff Durbin is a world karate champion, and he threatened to just destroy me. So what am I supposed to do? No. When I went to Apologia Church in 2018, I was a lukewarm amillennialist. I was raised as a dispensational premillennialist. That was part of my DNA. I was an independent fundamentalist Baptist, and I could argue anything with you. But then when I started doing apologetics, I started learning, hermeneutics and exegesis. I realized I couldn't substantiate that, and so for a long time I was the dreaded pan-millennialist. It'll all pan out in the end, and I joke about that. But the reality is, I lived most of my adult life with eschatology someplace over there, and I knew there were certain aspects of eschatology. Heaven and hell, judgment, those are all aspects of eschatology. You can't just leave them off to the side. That's a vitally important aspect of things. But we're talking about the understanding of the order of wrapping things up and what God's purposes are. And so I knew that the other elders at Apologia were postmillennialists. And they sort of said, well, do you think Christ is going to be victorious? That's enough for us. We'll be okay for now on that, I think they just sort of figured they just keep working on me. And Jeff was preaching through Matthew and had been in Matthew forever, and really was in Matthew 24 for about a year and a half. It really was. So, and it was very helpful, I'll be honest with you, because I had kept things off to a side. To answer your question, what caused me to come out and to... There were a number of books that I read. There were some excellent videos that I watched, honestly, that really helped. On Earth as It Is in Heaven is a video on YouTube that the guy who put that together actually just interviewed me a few months ago for the follow-up video. I think it's a little bit early for me. I'm just a newbie, but they did anyways. But that was really, really helpful. There were, and this gets me in trouble with everybody, but there were two particular statements from Doug Wilson that just stopped me in my tracks. One of them was, why is it Christians never think about their great-grandchildren? And having been raised, now, like I said, I did eventually adopt amillennialism, but I just was never passionate about it. It was just a default position. It was just sort of, it's there, whatever. But when I thought about that, and I had been thinking a lot about my grandchildren, why do we never think about our great-grandchildren? Because the way I was raised, I was never going to have great-grandchildren. I was never going to have great-grandchildren. So why should I even be thinking about preparing for them? And then the other question was, and this one really rang my bell, what if we're still in the early church? Because I was raised, and I knew as a church historian that every generation has thought, they're it. This is it. We're wrapping it up now. It's coming. I can see the four horsemen coming. They're coming right over. They're coming from Harrisburg right now. I mean, I remember when Kissinger's name added up to 666 and Nixon's name added up to 666 and everybody's name adds up to 666 depending on how you want to do it. Unless you use manuscript P115 where the number is 616, but that's a whole other issue. We don't get into that today. So that was just part of where I was coming from. As I read these books, what I realized is postmillennialism doesn't start down here with Daniel 9 and figuring out Matthew chapter 24 and seeing if, are there 10, I remember there are 10 nations in the European unions, that's the 10-headed beast, and, how many people does the Chinese army have because there needs to be that many million coming in because the Revelation says this and all the rest of that kind of stuff. Postmillennialism starts at the top and says, here is God's ultimate purpose. And it goes to Psalm 2, and it goes to Psalm 110, and it goes to Isaiah 42, and says these are the overarching things. So the one verse is quoted more times in the New Testament than any other is Psalm 110:1. And what's the next verse say? Yahweh will stretch forth your scepter to rule over the nations. And then you go to 1 Corinthians chapter 15, and what are we told? It is necessary for him to reign until all his enemies be put under his feet. And that's a present tense reigning. All authority has been given to him in heaven and earth. And I recognized that I had always limited that to pretty much heaven. And on earth, only in a spiritual sense. And so what attracted me especially was, I basically, when you think about it, if you're Reformed, you have to accept the idea that if God wanted to convert the majority of the world, he can do it. And I had always been, well, we're just this, it's just going to get worse and worse and worse, and why you're polishing brass on a sinking ship, and blah, 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 blah. But as I looked at those texts and I saw the overarching themes coming together and intersecting with the rest of the theology I already had. What I had not liked about eschatology was just the fights and the arguments and the debates that always produced so much more heat than light, because it was always down here in the weeds. There was no overarching structure that tied everything together. You start up here and then move down from there. And postmillennialism allows me to do that. And I do not claim to be people can come up and ask, well, what about, how does Daniel 9 fit with it? I'll go, I have no earthly idea. And I'm not interested in finding out, and I'm too old to be reading all the books to figure it out. But what I've seen is the intersection with the rest of my theology. And why is it important right now? Postmillennialism does not say there's just this perfectly straight line. It gets better and better and better and better. As a church historian, I've seen ups and I've seen downs and I've seen valleys, and yet we're moving toward what would be the consummation of all things. And there could be a deep, dark valley ahead of us. And I have to have a confidence that in the midst of that deep, dark valley, God has a purpose. And especially now as I think about my grandchildren, they have to have some foundation to stand on. And that foundation is not... I grew up in a house where we literally had a plaque right inside the front door, and I bet you all have seen this, that says, if we have disappeared, it's because of what's called the rapture. Okay? It was inside the front door of our house. And so, if that's what you think is going to be your way out, okay, but what if that's not what the New Testament's teaching? That he's going to provide a way through, and then his kingdom is going to provide the foundation for a glorious future where the nations are seeking after his law. The coasts seeking after the law, Isaiah 42. That means I have to be investing my life into my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren and providing them with that foundation. For even if they have to go through that great darkness, I have the confidence he will put his enemies under his feet. And one last part of the sermon. Hey, you asked me, so I cannot think of a greater enemy to the person and message of Jesus Christ than secular humanism in all of the history of mankind. You go, what do you mean? Well, think about it. Even the Romans at least were theists. They still had some kind of an idea of a transcendent something. Secularism is the absolute negation of everything that is good about God's creation. You're nothing but a fizzing bag of chemicals. You have no meaning. You have no purpose. When you die, that's it. No one cares. The universe doesn't care. If a big old honking asteroid comes tonight and destroys the whole planet, the universe will not care. Nothing matters. There is no love. There is no purpose. There's nothing. That's an enemy to Christ. It must be put under his feet. It must be put under his feet. How's that going to happen? Well, some people say, well, when Christ returns, he just destroys all of his enemies. Boom. Well, okay. If that's how he wants to do it, fine. I just have seen for 2,000 years now that he puts his enemies under his feet by reigning through his people. And I just wonder if that's not a better way of understanding it. So there's the sermon you asked, and I provided. So there you go.
Good, thank you. The next one, how does divine simplicity claim that God's attributes are essentially the same, yet affirm that the Son is not the Father is not the Son, and the Spirit is not the Son? Do they think that the triune God is made up of parts?
Where in the world did you get that? Did that come from you? No? Okay.
I did not.
So what I'm gathering from the questions is that you all slept through my entire talk. Is that... Is it the sweater? Is it the beard? Notice how long the beard is. Now, it's not as long as this gentleman here, or this gentleman here, but it's whiter than both of you. I've always wanted a white beard, and so finally I can grow one. Wow. When am I supposed to get back tonight? Okay. I'm not going to go into much detail on this because the fact of the matter is that the question is dealing with a controversy that I'm involved with right now, and if you follow me, you know that I am. And I have been spending a fair amount of time on the dividing line trying to, initially I was trying to avoid schism and unnecessary division amongst Reformed folks, but I failed at that. And so the doctrine of divine simplicity is not something that the vast majority of Christians have ever even heard of before, to be honest with you. It is the doctrine that God's being is simple, not compound. What does that mean? God's not made up of lesser parts. My beautiful GMC truck out there, which I'm very, very thankful for, and I'm so thankful that they designed the front seat that I can sit in it and not die after sitting in it for many hours at a time. It's made up of parts. It's not simple. And if you take certain key parts out of it, it doesn't work anymore. God is not made up of parts. Now, I believe in divine simplicity because biblically, God has to be simple. Why? Because he's the creator of all things, and he's eternal. And so if he's eternal, he's the creator of all things, how could he be made up of something that he himself would have had to have created in the first place? So you can make a biblical argument for simplicity. But here's what's going on, and I'm deeply burdened by this. I'll be straight up front with you. I have been canceled and slandered by an unbelievable number of men for whom I have preached in their churches and taught in their schools since December of last year. It has not been an enjoyable period of time. And I've been called a neo-Socinian. The Socinians denied the deity of Christ. They denied the Trinity. Anyone who says, I deny the deity of Christ and the Trinity is obviously not playing with the full deck, but this type of thing has been taking place. And all because I continue to stand firmly where I have stood for 30 years. And it's not just on this issue of the Trinity. What's really going on is this is a much more basic issue that has to do with sola scriptura. It has to do with the ultimate authority of Scripture in relationship to creeds. So, for example, I started a firestorm by saying that the Council of Nicaea is true. What it said was true. Not because it was the Council of Nicaea, but because what it said is consistent with the Bible, with Scripture. And you might be sitting there going, yeah, what's wrong with that? Nothing's wrong with that. It's what I've always taught. But many of the people who I thought we were all on the same page no longer believe that. They have become very enamored with something called natural theology, speculative theology, and with a man that most of us have not spent much time reading by the name of Thomas Aquinas, the doctor of the Roman Catholic Church. And what is amazing today is you can go to Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, a Southern Baptist institution, and they now have a center there for classical theism, and you can get a scholarship by writing papers on theological subjects and mimicking as closely as possible the methodology of Thomas Aquinas. And so I have been trying to sound somewhat of an alarm, but it has been incredibly costly. Now, the question that was asked is one of the key questions, and it is, how does divine simplicity function with the doctrine of the Trinity? I'm not going to, I just don't have the time to go into that right now, but let me just mention the one aspect of a scholastic philosophical doctrine of simplicity that I have a problem with, and that's why people say, oh, he doesn't really believe in divine simplicity. What they're saying is, I don't believe in a philosophical doctrine of divine simplicity, because it's derived from someone named Thomas Aquinas via someone, well, actually it's from Aristotle via Aquinas. And that's this. And it was said in the question said this. If God is not made up of parts, then what that means is all of God's attributes are simply God. And therefore, internally to God, all of his attributes are one. And what the result of that is that internally to God, God's omniscience, knowing all, having all knowledge, is the same as his justice, which is the same as his love, which is the same as his omnipresence. And I just go, the only basis you can have for saying that, again, goes back to Aquinas. And in their thinking, if the human mind can differentiate between two things, that makes the two things things. And that would make different things in God, and that would deny his simplicity. I just don't believe that that metaphysical concept is true. The attributes of God, these are true statements about the being of God. They're not things. You don't have a substance called omniscience that you add to a substance called justice and then put the rest of them together and the result is God. That's absurd. I just don't see the slightest evidence that any one of the apostles of Jesus Christ ever even thought along these lines, let alone taught anything that could be considered to be the definition of orthodoxy. This is development that comes hundreds and hundreds, and in Thomas's case, 1,200 years after the time of Christ, and needs to be recognized as such. So that's what this is all about. That's what that dispute's all about. I'll be honest with you, I'm sick and tired of it. I am sick and tired of it. But I will continue to deal with it because the issue is not simplicity. The issue is what is the ultimate authority for defining the Christian faith? And if it's not theonusos, then it's not divine. And I have been defending the doctrine of sola scriptura for a very long time. And by God's grace, I'll go to my grave defending the doctrine of sola scriptura. And it just seems to me that some of what I thought were my dear friends, have just not thought this through. And just pray that it can be done in the proper way, in a way that's honoring to Christ, because it's tiring. It's tiring. It really is.
Next question. So that letter written to the miners was so faithful, yet I fear that such a letter written today would be received with, quote, this is great for eternity, but what does it do for me now? The high view seems to be lost and the word of God diminished. How do we turn this around for the next generation?
Okay, I'm sorry. I missed the connection between the letter and what we're turning around. Could you forgive me? I missed something.
I'll read it again.
Okay.
That letter written to the miners was so faithful, yet I fear that such a letter written today would be received with, "This is great for eternity. What does it do for me now?"
Oh, okay. Well, the world wasn't a big place for someone living in a mine. Okay? And what does it do for me now is it sustains me in the midst of my dying. And there are, what has sustained Christians living in Muslim countries who have been imprisoned for their faith? When they know all they would have to say for the prison door to be open is La ilaha illallah wa Muhammadan Rasulullah. That's the Shahada. That's how you become a Muslim. Say that with real intent in Arabic, and you become a Muslim. That's why I can say it in Arabic without real intent and not become a Muslim, so don't worry about it. They know that's how easy it would be to get out. They don't do it because they know to say there is only one God, Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger, is to deny who Jesus is. What sustains them? The Spirit of God and love of Christ. What sustains Christians in Chinese prisons today? The exact same thing. And so, what does it do for me now? It's the only thing that gives me life right now. And what does it do for me now in the sense of the word faith movement and getting me out of prison and making me healthy and wealthy and wise and the rest of that stuff. That's not Christianity. So that's the problem, is that we think that it is Christianity that we have all of our stuff and we love all of our stuff and get more of our stuff. And that's never been the Christian message, and it can't be. There is an otherworldliness. There is a true aspect. It always has to be in balance. There's things we have to do in this life. I get all that stuff. But, that's been the strength of the martyr church all along.
Okay. What is the difference between a Calvinist Baptist and a confessional Baptist?
Well, there shouldn't be any difference in the controversy going on right now. There are those who are saying that their interpretation of the confession is the only interpretation that is to be had. I've had some Presbyterian friends contact me and said, sort of watching what's going on amongst you Baptists, y'all need to come to recognize what we've recognized for a long time. And that is that you need to allow for a range of interpretations of the Westminster Confession of Faith, or you're all going to be killing each other constantly. And it's true. So especially in this instance, there's literally, as far as I can tell, there is exactly 1/3 of a sentence that is in dispute here. And I will say what I've said it privately, I'll say it here publicly. There's a camera there, who cares? When Reformed Baptists split over the subject of impassibility, about 2010-ish, somewhere around in there, when I read the two sides, I didn't feel like I could put an envelope between the two. They were so close. And we have to have a level of maturity to allow for that level of difference. If you become so strict in your interpretation of your confession that you can't have any give or take, most of you know, it's not like this is an area of a lot of earthquakes, but in California and places like that, when you build a building, the way to build a building so that it's still there after the earthquake is it has to be able to sway. It has to be able to give. It has to be able to move. You make it rock solid so it's completely stiff, and that's the first building going down in the earthquake because it has no flexibility. And I just get the feeling that Reformed Baptists in general, we need a meaningful, functional Catholicity with a small c. that allows us not only to have some differences amongst ourselves, but to also cooperate and work with others that have larger differences. And obviously, I've been a weirdo along those lines for a while, because I am close friends with and consider to be dear brothers people as divergent as Doug Wilson and Michael Brown. They're very different. They're both really bright, and I've debated both of them. And in Michael Brown's case, I've debated on his together with him. We're both on the same side, and then we've debated against each other as well. And hopefully, that's just an example of how that works. Of course, Michael Brown doesn't claim to be a Reformed Baptist, and neither does Doug Wilson. So we're open about that. We're not hiding anything. So the difference between a Calvinistic Baptist and confessionalist Baptist, the confessional Baptist may have the London Baptist Confession, and hence goes beyond just the 5 points of Calvinism and recognizes that Reformed theology also addresses the form of the church, the worship of the church, the sacraments, the supper, things like that. And so I suppose you could have people who hold the 5 points but don't really see that there's more to it than that. So maybe that's part of the question too.
A couple more left. In a few words, what is the enduring legacy and lessons for today from the Anabaptists at Munster?
I really am finding these questions absolutely fascinating. You're a bunch of weirdos. I am out in the middle of cornfields with weirdos. It's very strange. I have no idea how to get home either.
Yeah, welcome to Friedensburg.
That's right. Okay, said a few words, so I will be very brief. If you would like to hear the wildest, craziest, most amazing story in all of church history, I'm not going to tell you tonight, but what I did do in February of 2019 is I did a 2-part series on my daughter's webcast. And my daughter has a webcast. I'm so proud of the fact that a number of years ago I was in Belfast. In fact, I did a debate, I think it was 2018, with a Roman Catholic in Belfast, Northern Ireland, on indulgences. Now, if you're too young, but if you're my age, you realize that was historic. You could not have had a debate in Belfast without it getting blown up by somebody in the 1970s. I mean, that was just the time, they call it the time of the Troubles. It was a real honor to do that, but I was in Belfast speaking at an Anglican church that hosted the debate. And I asked at the beginning, I said, hey, by the way, how many of you are aware of and listen to my daughter's webcast, Sheologians? And about a third of the people in the audience put their hands up. I was astonished. Summer's done a great job. I did 2 episodes, so 2 hours, narrating for them the entire story of Munster. And I will never forget the look on both their faces. I mean, my daughter's sitting there going, Dad, come on. No way. Seriously? And it's like, no, honey. This event in church history, honestly, they could do a movie and never invent anything. Do it strictly by what happened, and it would be a blockbuster. They would never have to add anything to make it more interesting. It was the craziest, and it had a huge impact on Europe, had a huge impact on Calvin. The Anabaptists at Munster tried to set up the kingdom of God. And the resultant siege of the city that lasted for months and months and months, the development of polygamy and the kingdom inside, and oh my goodness, what people did and how it all ended is astonishing. But I'll just tell you one thing. Google, let me see, what would pull it up for you? Munster Cages Cathedral. Let's see. Munster, don't put Minster like I just did because that won't work. Munster Cathedral Cages. Wink. Oh yeah. Bing, 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 bing. Immediately, I have 6 images on my phone. And any of you doing it see exactly what I'm looking at right now. There are 3 cages that hang on the side of the cathedral in Munster. I have a bunch of pictures of these that I took in January of 2019. I went to Munster. I didn't go to Munster to take pictures of the cages. I went to Munster to, Munster is the head, that's where the Institute for New Testament Manuscript Studies is found. It's the headquarters of the Greek texts that we have today, the Messianic UBS, the ECM, and so on and so forth. I was going there for that, but hey, I'm in Munster, so I went and took many pictures of that. Those 3 cages have hung there since 1534. And when they were first put up, they had dead bodies in them. And they were the dead bodies of the leaders of the Munster Rebellion. And they had been tortured to death. They had been chained to a stake and were to be publicly tortured for 1 hour. And if you passed out from the pain, they stopped the clock until you revived. You had to suffer for 1 hour. You say, well, what do you mean by tortured? Tongs on fire, ripping at your flesh, cutting your tongue out of your mouth, ripping muscles off your body. And the other 2 guys had to sit there and listen as the first guy got tortured. And then once he's dead, you go to the next guy. Can you imagine being number 3? And they took those mangled bodies and they put them in those cages and they hung them up there. I think about 10, 15 years later, they pulled them down long enough to pull the skeletons out because people were tired of body parts falling on them when they left church. And they put them back up there as a testimony to all of Europe. Never again. Never again. And what's fascinating is I think it was 2008 or 2010, they actually had a vote in Munster. Shall we take them down? Because you'd think by now, it's a fully secular city. Most people probably don't even know why they're up there. They voted and said, nope, they're staying. And there they hang to this day. Now, I think one of them was knocked down during bombing during World War II. And they repaired it and put it back up. Because that was their culture's way of saying, what happened here can never be allowed to happen again. What happened there? You'll have to go listen. It is, without a doubt, the craziest, wildest story in all of church history. Nothing comes close.
Okay, last question. Is your debate tomorrow similar in nature to the KJV only movement?
It's identical and different. And the reason I say that is Dr. Van Cleek does promote the KJV as the standard English text for the church, but he comes at it from a completely unique perspective. And in fact, the 3 books that he and his dad have written, the last one wasn't published. They're self-published, but the last one wasn't published until June of this year. And so this is a very unique perspective. It's the first time I've ever heard Alvin Plantinga's Reformed epistemology being applied in this area, and I think there's a reason for that, which we'll point out in the debate. It doesn't work. But what it does represent is yet another of the various attempts In Reformed contexts, Reformed Baptists and OPC primarily is where this is at. To say we've strayed by going after the modern Greek text, we need to go back to the text that was used at the time of the Reformation. And I consider it a complete abandonment of the historical defense of the New Testament. I think it's the end of Christian apologetics and the end of the Reformed people having any meaningful say in the defense of the faith, and that's why I stand firmly against it, have from the beginning. I'm really looking forward to it. I have read all of their books and listened to hours of dialogue that they've done. Thanks a lot, Chris. Because I had never heard of them. I had never heard the Van Cleek perspective. And then Chris calls up and says, hey, I've found this person. And I go look, and oh, great, 4 books to read. Okay, all right, this is only a few weeks ago. I mean, this is literally just a few weeks ago. And so if you wonder what I've been listening to while driving across the United States, now you know. So I'm looking forward to tomorrow. I think it'll be very useful in the end in continuing the documentation of the fact that this movement simply cannot defend itself. It can't. So it needs to be exposed in that way. Hopefully it'll be very cordial, but something tells me it'll be sharp as well.
Well, we just want to thank you for coming out here. Thank you for taking the time to spend with us, to minister to us. We'll pray for you, and then just want to have one more announcement. So let's all pray together.